he's so well known that there's actually a conspiracy to make sure that he's not well known. If you understand, if you get my drift. Because Dr. Amos Wilson is somebody who's been working relentlessly, quietly, all along, dealing with these problems that some of these psychiatrists are, playing games with. Because if you read Amos's work, then there's no question about what it is that has made our people react the way they have. It's the same thing happens to the Latino community, particularly the Puerto Ricano, those brothers and sisters who actually labor, for the independence of Puerto Rico. I remember when Lolita LeBron came here in 1994, and a lot of the brothers, Irvin Flores and the rest of them, the people who in 1954 went up to the White House, to see Truman the hard way, to let them know that there was something called Puerto Rico, and they wanted to have their independence. And they shot the place up. And I remember as a little kid, wondering about, wow, this is really going to be in big trouble. Make them have a very difficult time, because you heard the adults saying that. And when Lolita came here, before she came, there was Mayor Dinkins, when he heard about it, said he didn't want any assassins or murderers, and there was a big to-do about it. And I wrote Lolita LeBron and told her to come ahead as the chairperson of the Harlem Reception Committee for Nelson Mandela. And she came, and later on she invited me to Puerto Rico, and I went down there to speak on behalf of the struggle here and the struggle in Puerto Rico. And I met with her at her house, and to see a person like that kind of spirit, that still remembers, that they are committed to fight for Puerto Rico's independence. So when Amos Wilson talks about the struggle of our African people and about that determination to break free of the control, because this whole thing is about control. It's about actually trying to dominate and control the mind space of people who, if they had their own free will, would strike out for freedom, which is the natural inclination of all people. And so Amos, what he does when he talks about the developmental psychology of the black child, is to show you at a very early age, before these people start talking about 3 years of age or 5 years of age, what they're going to try to do to control the child. As a matter of fact, if you really look at it, this whole violence initiative is aimed at making sure that Amos's program doesn't work. Because Amos is trying to grab the mind of the black child to put the child in a position where he will grow up normal and understanding he's an African and what that means and all that entails historically, and even to the kind of demands that it makes on our present condition. So when he talks about, so-called black-on-black violence and the psychodynamics of black self-annihilation in the service of white domination, he's laying out, a whole idea about how black-on-black crime, whether in the United States or in South Africa, is not something that is genetically or innately, and objectively just introduced into this whole struggle now, but it's something that is systematically placed there for a political reason. And that's to control the struggle of our people, and really to take some of the best people off and have them, as Fanon say, develop into a campaign or a pattern of order-destructive behavior. And therefore we become our own worst enemies. So Amos Wilson is the one who feels that allows us to break free of that, because he understands more than anybody else how to get out of that particular pattern. With that in mind, without any further ado, will you please welcome Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you kindly. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you here again. It's been a while. It's not because I've desired to stay away, but it's because, to a good degree, I'm away to hopefully bring a new gift to the community. The gift I hope we'll be able to deliver into the community will begin around November. That will be the time when we will initiate a series of 10 weeks of lectures on power. I was talking here earlier to a brother who was talking about the fact that we describe these issues a great deal. We talk about them and we analyze them, and we rarely get a chance to talk about solutions. Well, we've been working on solutions. We're going to talk about power not from the point of view of being victimized by it, but by developing it and using it against our enemies. At the last lecture I gave at the Slave Theater, where we were talking about global white supremacy, I initiated this theme on power by saying that we can explain the reasons Europeans victimize us in as many ways as we would like. We could talk about them as being ice people, as against the sun people, and that explanation is valid. I have no problems with it. We can talk about them in terms of their protecting their more recessive genes against our more dominant genes. We can even get into a little psychoanalysis and deal with the myth of length of penises and penis envy and all the other things, and black balls and white balls and brown balls and black holes and white balls rolling into black holes and things of this nature. And all that's fine. That's a lot of fun. But no matter how you explain why or how the European got to the point of victimizing us, I think the essential issue is that the European victimizes us because he can, because he has the power to do so. And we are victimized because we haven't developed the power to prevent his doing so. So in a sense, no matter how we explain why he does what he does, at the end point, he does what he does because he can. And consequently then, I infer from this that we can end his victimization of us when we end his power to do so. And consequently, I want to bring into the domain of discussion in this community the subject matter of power. I want us, in addition to studying black history and culture, to study power, its accumulation, its use, and application. We should talk about it every day and everywhere. And we should read about it, and we should develop the means of using it. We should come to understand the nature of how white power is organized. In the end, power does not flow from the genes of white folk. Does that not flow from their ice age? It flows from the nature of their organization and the way they have chosen to relate one to the others. And it flows from their intentionality as a people and their appropriate organization of themselves to realize their intentionality, one of which is, of course, the domination of African people. And that means then that we as African people must study the rules of organization. We must study the means of relating one to each other in such a way that we multiply our power. And we must study our enemy's organization such that we can probe that organization and destroy the power of the enemy. And we can do it. We have a tremendous amount of power in our hands. Right here in America, we are not a weak people by any stretch of the imagination. The only weakness is in our minds and in our imaginations. That's the only place. We are not a dependent people in the material sense, only in the psychological sense. The only thing, ladies and gentlemen, we must get over is our cowardice. That's the only thing. That's the only thing. And we can change this. I will speak briefly then to the issue this evening relating to the message that Dr. Bregan brought you last week around this conference titled Genetic Factors in Crime, Findings, Uses, and Implications, which was to occur at the University of Maryland. I've warned you many times, and I've told you many times, I don't know whether it gets through to you or not, that we as black people must get over this thing of looking at schools and universities as advanced vocational training institutions. How many people recall that I've repeated this time and time again? That the function of education is not jobs. That is not the primary function. Children and people are educated. The primary function for education is to advance the interests of a people and to protect their interests, to secure their survival. That the educational structures and institutions of this country are as much a part of its defense, of its armed forces, as are its soldiers. The bombs, the weaponry that this nation uses against other nations and intimidates other nations with, develop out of the universities. The germ warfare, the chemical warfare, political, because some great professor is the head of this particular department, or they have illustrious names in the department, chances are you will never see them teach you in a class. The graduate students on some kind of assistantship will more likely be your teacher. Where are the brains and where are the professors? They're doing research. And often they're doing research on government grants for the government, for the corporations, for the other institutions in the society, and they are part of then the total system of domination of this country. Afrocentric education above all, and even beyond the teaching of African history and African culture, is preparing our children to defend the very lives of African people. Is a military preparation and a preparation for war. It is the means by which we will maintain our biological survival as a people. For if you do not survive, what does it matter if you teach reading to 100% of our children, or they learn math well, or they learn computer science, or all the other things you think are important, when your very lives are in the balance, and it is very likely that they will be snuffed out in the next 10 to 20 years. And yet we still continue to look at schools and colleges and universities as vocational institutions. And here we have then at the University of Maryland, long connected with the U.S. Army, by the way, hosting a conference on so-called genetic factors in crime. Bregan charged that this meeting, which was canceled, was part of a broader program, a violence initiative, a federal government research agenda, so that this program was only a part of a larger agenda. And it was designed to move toward finding a genetic marker that would supposedly identify children at high risk of becoming criminals, and to develop plans to deter them through medication. And this is interesting due to the fact that there's little or no real information that links directly in any kind of strong way or even in a mild way a relationship between genes and criminality. There's been no DNA segment that has been discovered that codes for crime. When you think about it, the idea is ludicrous anyway. What is crime? What is violence? What is violence? In other words, I'm asking this question because you have to do a linguistic analysis. They are all forms of what? Violence. There are many different types of what? Crime. Different types of aggression. Not all violence is necessarily bad. There is what we in psychology may call hostile aggression. But there is aggression or violence that may be used in terms of what? Self-defense. Violence may be used to protect your children from attack. Violence may be used to protect the lives of other people. So now if we're going to get a gene for violence, or a type of violence, or in removing the gene for violence, if we were to find it, which is an unlikely situation, are we also removing a people's capacity to defend themselves and to use violence in their own interest? What I'm saying is then, be very careful when people use words like violence, aggression, crime, and so forth, and ask yourself, what kind of crime? You know, do we have a gene for every type of crime you can name, so that even when we change definitions of crime, a new gene comes into being that we're going to find related to that particular crime? And when we decide that certain other behavior is no longer a crime, will the gene which was coded for that crime disappear? Ludicrous. Ludicrous. I talk in Black on Black Violence about the structuration of crime. That crime follows, the type of violence that we talk about, or crime, even its nature, follows the class structure and follows the skills levels of criminals. You see? Why is there so much so-called violent crime in certain segments of the society? Because when you look at the skills levels of the people committing them, if they were to commit a crime, that's about the only crime they could commit. If they were accountants, they would commit the crime of embezzlement and steal hundreds of thousands or millions because they have a particular ability or skill. And you'd be a fool if you were an accountant or in an S&L where you could steal millions of dollars and then make the public pay billions back and then hang out on the street and knock somebody out in the head. So here we have this crimogenic society that robs our people of skills and other means, so that if they decide to participate in a crime, then the probability is that it will be violent by the very nature of the way the society has set them up in the beginning. In other words, the society even determines the type of crime you are most likely to commit itself. Okay? And then it tells you, you're violent. Teach me to be an accountant. I won't hit any more people in the head. I'll just rob them by books. Okay? And then they want to talk about white-collar crime and, and the other kind of collar crime. Come on, wake up. This has nothing to do with genes. It has to do with the nature. I've also told you about reversal, right? I mentioned the fact that in order for us as a people to be in the situation that we're in, we literally have to be turned backwards. We have to think backwards, behave backwardly, deal with the world backwardly. It's necessary. This is the only way this system can maintain itself. Sometimes I say the best way to win an argument is to concede to your opponent. Okay, there is a genetic marker for crime. Let's now look at the criminal record of African peoples and European peoples. The record is clear. If there is a genetic marker for crime, when we look at the fact that the European has committed a crime against every people on every continent, destroyed millions of people, then that argues for his genetic criminality. And that argues then for us to medicate him and control him. You know, the other thing I'm surprised at is we keep being surprised. We keep thinking that this is some new initiative. I mean, the violence initiative began with our enslavement and continues today. We already have bought the violence initiative, ladies and gentlemen. It is already operating. We bought it when we bought learning disabilities, when we bought the concept of hyperactivity, when we bought the concept of impulsivity, when we bought the concept of special education. You're already in it. Connected to these so-called symptoms of learning disability are the very same symptoms they're going to try to connect to the so-called genetic markers. And our children are already being drugged. The violence initiative has already occurred because our youth are already going to jail in record numbers. So why are we talking about these people are initiating something to bring and put our youth in jail? They're already in jail. Those that are not already in jail are in juvenile detention, are under the aegis of the BCWs. You heard it tonight. In the special education program, already being drugged, already being therapized, already having their minds distorted in various ways. And the worst violence initiative program is the public educational system itself. So this so-called initiative that you're talking about tonight is a mopping up operation. That's all it is. If you're telling me in Washington, D.C. and other places, black youth and black people, 75% are in some form of contact with the criminal justice system already, some 60% in any given day in Baltimore and other areas already in contact with the criminal justice system, well then what will this new initiative do? Just make it what? 100%. We should have already been what? Upset. Why are we kicking and screaming now? We should have been screaming already. This initiative is an old trick in psychiatry and psychology. It's a trick that we call the medicalization of social problems. That is to define a social and political problem as a medical problem, and to put psychiatrists who are doctors, physicians with MDs in control of the definition of these problems, even though they are an arm of the state, as are social workers, as are psychologists, as are all of the other helping professionals, but members of the state and arms of the state. But we are so willing to submit to their authority such that when they define social and political behavior and behavior which has social and political causes in medical terms, even the oppressed and the victimized consent to their mistreatment. Louis Sullivan is a part of this. But in a sense, we are all a part of it, because we buy the medicalization of issues. And they know, since we are willing to do anything the doctor tells us to do, why are you taking that poison? The doctor said take it every 2 hours. The doctor says. So now if the doctor says that your children have a marker, a genetic marker, then let's go with it. And we don't have time this evening, one of these days we'll talk about psychiatric power and the role of psychiatrists in the system. Oh, the history of psychiatrists is horrendous. You won't believe it. You won't believe the tortures that have been created in the name of psychiatry, that are even being perpetrated today. You won't believe the robbing of civil liberties, the robbing of freedom, and all other kinds of things, the complete destruction and taking away of people's constitutional rights, but in the name of psychiatry. When you medicalize a problem and define it in medical terms, the patient loses all rights. And therefore you can resolve a lot of issues that, if they were defined politically or socially, would then become constitutional and legal issues. But as soon as they are put under the aegis of medicine, then you reduce to a very great extent the legal and constitutional implications. So what we have going here then is an attempt to move social and political problems into the area of psychiatry, so that we, even as African people, can consent to social control and the killing of our people. One quick thing, and I know we're short here. Don't get caught up in this brain and biological basis of behavior. Okay? Don't be deceived because someone can say that they have found a biological correlate with behavior. That means it is genetic in nature, or that means it's congenital, or that means that the society has no responsibility for the behavior that the person is committing. Don't buy that baloney. And people run that a lot. You know, as soon as we can locate some kind of brain deficiency and correlate it, then we're ready to say, oh, society is not responsible for it. Are you kidding? Learning and experience physically transforms the brain. Traumatic experiences and even positive experiences changes the biochemical nature of the brain, as well as the neuronal functional organization of the brain, and influences the number of dendrites and synapses and other things that cells use to communicate one with the other. Now, you must understand here then, and I could talk a great deal here about the experiments here that have shown very clearly that if you put certain animals through certain experiences, their brains actually can increase in weight. Let me give you a quick run of things that happens when some rats were placed in various environments. One group was placed in a so-called enriched environment. These rats being selected from the same genetic background, having the same genetic background and the same genetic inheritance. But they were put in under different environments. After they were after they lived in these environments for a while, they were sacrificed and their brains looked at, weighed, measured, and analyzed. Now, those rats that were put in an enriched environment, let's look at some of the things that were found. They had an increased thickness of the cerebral cortex, or the gray matter. In other words, the thinking matter of their brain increased in thickness and weight. A 15% increase in the actual size of the neurons in the cortex. Increases in protein in the brain, paralleling the increases in cortical weight, indicating that the growth effect was on tissue and not just on the fluid content of the brain. An increase in the amount of dendritic branching, dendrites of the hairy branching fibers which project in large numbers from the body of each neuron and which receive input from other neurons and conduct them to the cell bodies of other neurons. There was an increase in the branching of these neurons, and a greater amount of potential information was available to each neuron. An increased number of dendritic spikes per unit length of dendrite. Increases in the number of synapses and the sizes of the contacts between the synapses. An increase in the ratio between the weight of the cortex and the weight of the rest of the brain. A 15% increase in the number of glial cells, and on we go. What are we saying here then? That experience changes the brain, changes the nature and the functionality of the brain. So simply because you may find a brain correlate does not take society off the hook. It means then that if society controls the experience of a people, controls their experiences, it is manipulating their brain and controlling its size. And so they want to run a game on you with this biological substrate number. A quick reference here to some tentative research that was noted in the New York Times Wednesday, September 16th. And you should read this piece, and the research is tentative, but read the scientific journals. But there's something interesting here. The headline reads, "Behavior therapy can change how the brain functions," researchers say. Like drug therapy, behavior modification therapy produces metabolic, what do we mean there? Chemical enzymatic changes in the brain and functional changes. That is how different parts and areas of the brain relate one to the other in controlling a behavior and initiating a behavior. Know what I'm saying? Like drug therapy, behavior modification. This is a non-drug therapy, right? This is a therapy based on social relationships between the therapist and the client. Okay, and that's what we are comparing here. And what does it say here then? Both of these produces metabolic and functional changes in the brains of people with obsessive compulsive disorder. It is the first time that behavior therapy, remember we're talking about a basic social thing here, even though there's some other adjuncts to it, a method that changes the way people think, and I'm emphasizing think, about uncomfortable thoughts or feelings, the way they deal with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. This therapy particularly relating to obsessive compulsive behavior where people are exhibiting certain attitudes toward compelling thoughts and behaviors. So this therapy, which seeks to change the way they think about these compulsive feelings and think about these thoughts and these urgings that keep telling them to do things, has been shown to physically alter brain function in a mental disorder. And we could go on, the piece is longer. I brought this up to get those who might think that we only talk about rats. What are we saying here then? That the very nature of human relations itself can change the functional nature of the brain. The idea being then that even when they come to you and tell you that there's some kind of correlation between a brain functionality and a particular behavior, don't fall for the okie-doke that necessarily means that the society is not responsible for producing that behavior. Society shapes the brain as it shapes other things as well. I'll move on quickly here. The theme of black-on-black violence, the book, is that the alleged criminality of black males will be used to justify the repression of the African American community and quite possibly its genocidal annihilation. In other words, the running theme of the book, Black-on-Black Violence, is this: that the alleged criminality of African males will be used as a major rationale so that when this society decides that it will annihilate this community, the other members and nations and people in the world will buy it because they have been convinced that we are innately criminal. And what I'm trying to get across in there then is how this propaganda is developed. This is why, despite what you say from a logical point of view, despite the fact you may say this is not the majority of our youth who are in jail, the vast majority of our youth are not engaged in violent behavior. The majority of people on welfare are not black people. The majority of people in prisons are not black folk. You know, you can lay one fact after another. And yet what happens? The people still insist in seeing it as a black problem, don't they? When you lay evidence and facts before a people, even evidence and fact that they themselves have collected, and they still insist in seeing you in a particular way, then you must recognize that they are seeing you in that way because it is important to their own psychological state of being and because it serves their own interest. Yes. And you must ask the question then, why are they obsessed about projecting this kind of image? And you will see then that it is there to rationalize their behavior against you. They're not, and therefore, as I will say a little later on, this idea of arguing with these people point for point is not what the game is about. It's not what it's about. Let me quickly move on. I want to lay a context, because often we discuss these issues out of context. And I've told you before, as I've told you in Black on Black Violence, that European sociology, psychology, and so forth decontextualizes issues, meaning that it discusses violence or crime as if they do not exist within a social context, as if they do not have a history, as if they do not serve a function in the society. So you're made to look directly at the behavior and the behavior only, and to judge it and treat it without looking at the context in which it occurs, and look at how the context itself may create the behavior. And even behavior therapy plays this game, by the way. Okay? You must start at the context first before you discuss these problems. What is the context? The context is this, that we are a dominated people. We are dominated by European people. Am I making myself clear? Yes. This is where we start. This is where you start. We are under the control of another people. We are vulnerable to that other people who are holding our lives and the quality of our lives in their hands. That's the fact you must start with. The second fact is, domination is a social problem. Am I clear here? Domination itself is a problem. It is a social problem, particularly for the dominated, isn't it? Even if it's for the dominator, it's still a social problem. Keep this in mind. Domination, therefore, generates the very existence of domination means that a social problem has been what? Generated. Huh? You can't have domination without having a what? Social problem. So domination generates a social problem, and as long as it exists, it maintains that social problem. As long as you're under the domination of Europeans, you will have social problems. There are some idiots among us who think that they can leave the European in control of African people and get justice and peace. It is not possible. Domination is built on injustice. And you cannot then leave the European in power over black people and then expect to receive justice. It's illogical. It's not possible. Domination benefits the dominator. We are dominated because it what? Benefits those who dominate us. Therefore, the dominator benefits from the social what? Problems. In other words, the problems of black people benefit white folk. And they are created for their benefit, and they are maintained for their benefit. And therefore, those who dominate us have an investment, monetarily and every other way, in perpetuating the symptoms of maladjustment in us as a people, and they engage in interactions that reinforce those problems. That's why no matter what kind of program they lay out for you, it does not resolve the social problems that they claim they're designed to resolve. And I'll be through in just a second or two here. The problems of the dominated provide evidence which justifies their domination and supports their own domination. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the major outcomes of power and one of the major benefits of being powerful is that you can generate the evidence to justify your power and to justify your domination. Why, when I go to prison, I see that 56% of you are in this prison. Therefore, we are justified in controlling you. But then we forget how what? They created the problem so that 56% could be in there. Now then, as the gentleman who wrote Blaming the Victim put forward, and I will say, first of all, this problem is created. Our problems are needed. This is what I'm arguing in Black on Black Violence, that this society needs the criminality of black males. It needs the fantasy that black males are criminals. It is necessary to the very structure and being of this society. It is very necessary to the self-definition of Europeans. It is very necessary to maintaining their domination and advancing their domination. Therefore, they must create these problems, or they must even imagine that these problems exist where they truly do not exist. Therefore, they create the problem, and then, as Ryan argues, first they identify the social problem. Second, they study those affected by the problem and discover in what ways they are different from the rest of us, this great underclass. How are they different from the rest of us? And you know now, arguing Black on Black, that the so-called criminals in the jails are not any different from any of the rest of us. You are not going to find a criminal personality, you know, and yet that's been the golden grail of psychology. You know, how can we distinguish these people from the rest of us? We're all in this game together. Third, they define the differences as the causes of the social problem. In other words, we create the problem. Then we go in and look at the people who have the problem and see how they're different from those who don't. And then we say, oh, their differences is the reason why they have the problem. You see? So they're going to create these brain dysfunctions. Then go in and find the brain dysfunction. And then say the brain dysfunction is the cause of the problem. Now let's medicate. So they define, they use the differences, and finally they assign a government bureaucrat to invent a humanitarian action program to correct the differences. I asked my class the other night, what if we could find a 100% sure shot rehabilitation program? A program that would rehabilitate 100% of the clients. Would that solve your problem? No, because what would happen? The others would keep what? Rolling in. Rolling in. So rehabilitating the ones who have the problem does not solve what? The original what? Cause of the problem. And again, we have people who enter into the wrong point of the equation. Let me get here then and say These controversies, such as the one we are dealing with now, they speak to the need for domination to justify and maintain itself. Howard Zinn stated, the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary, to maintain its control, kill us. Hear that, black bourgeoisie. A part of your being promoted in American society is to maintain control of the black community. The day that your death is necessary also to maintain control and to maintain white power, they will kill you as well. And I want you to keep this in mind then. I don't want you to fall into the trap of discussing this particular issue. We fall into a trap by concentrating on the scientific and methodological details. You know, well, there's no genes. When you find it, forget all that nonsense. And get caught up in personalities. Well, Goodwin is an evil guy. Louis Sullivan is a... Screw all of that. It's the same kind of thing you have with Columbus. If Columbus had not discovered America, some other European would have. Even if you could step back into history and kill Columbus, you'd still be in the same shape you are right now. Because what is the essential problem here? Columbus didn't build the ships. Columbus didn't build the technology. It was European technology, political and economic organization that made it possible for Columbus to come over here. And it was European technology, organization, intentionality that made it possible for them to overrun the Indian nations. What you have here then were two different cultures and two different technologies and two different ways of thinking facing each other, and one ran over the other. Not Columbus. I want you to get out of the personality issue and deal with the deep issue. You are facing a society and a culture. You are facing an organization that will put man after man after man in front of you, but it will still run its same program. You must learn to cripple the organization, not the person. This is an old argument. It's the same kind of old game that went on with the genetic basis of intelligence. Just the same old game refried. What do we have here? Let's look at the deeper issue. And the deeper issue involves the need to justify domination, social control, and to obscure the very real way deficiencies are created by power relations. Quick question here. Why are whites obsessively concerned with the intelligence of black folks? This is the thing you must ask first before you get into whether it's environment or genes. Ask the major question. Why are you interested? What's the point? Huh? Why is it so what? Important for you to know. What are you going to do with the knowledge? This is the issue. What would be the result if it was definitely and irrefutably established that blacks are innately less intelligent than whites? Let's ask that question. Let's ask another one. Or we found irrefutably that we were more intelligent than whites. What would be the result? Or just as intelligent as whites, or that environment is really significantly influential in determining intelligence. What would be the result if we discovered either one of these things? What would be the result if we proved that blacks were genetically more docile than white folk? The end result would what? Be the same. Would be the same. Nothing is going to change. Why? The findings, whatever their nature, will be used to justify and rationalize the social control of black people by white people. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if they proved that we were innately less intelligent than they would justify domination, wouldn't it? We are more intelligent, therefore we have a right to rule over you. But then if you prove to them in your great work that you are more intelligent than they are, well, these people are more intelligent than we are. We should suppress them while we can, because if we let them loose, they will take over. So the repression will still take place, and it will still be argued. Well, they are as intelligent as we are, and that means one day they may compete with us, so let's still what? Repress them. Oh, you mean the environment is truly significant in intelligence. So what would the result be then? Let us control what? The environment to control their intelligence. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the final come down of it all, no matter how you refute these people, no matter how much detail you roll out one way or the other, they will always be used to do what? Justify repression and oppression. That is the issue, not making fine-pointed arguments as to whether IQ tests are culturally based or genetically based or this so-called initiative here. It's pointless. What we have going here is an attempt by people who are dominating us to create new rules and means by which they justify their domination and repression. That's all that's going on here. Screw whatever excuse they roll up in time. The only thing that has changed by any so-called new initiative, such as the one we're talking about today, is the logic of justification for continuing domination and the methodology of domination. That's the only thing that's changed. Nothing has changed by this new initiative. All they said, well, their violence is a medical problem, and therefore now the methodology for that is to do what? Cut their brains out and medicate them and so forth. But the end result is still what? Domination and control. Thus the central issue revolves around power and domination and maintaining the relative powerlessness of black people and finding rationales for doing so. For a very sizable percentage of black problems flow from the nature of black and white power relations. These problems that we are dealing with flow from our powerlessness, from the power differential between blacks and white folk. They reflect the differences in power between us as people. Nothing else. No brain issues here. The issue then for the black community is this: how to break white power and the will of whites and any other ethnic group to dominate and exploit African people. And I'm telling you, any other ethnic group, because whites are not the only ones who are moving in place to dominate African people. And the issue then is this, and you must keep this in mind: this must be our agenda. This is our agenda, to break the power of people to control our lives. This is the agenda. An agenda set by us, not by others. Our program for change and empowerment, for enhancing the education of our children, for maximizing our quality of life, should continue regardless of academic and social debates regarding the social or genetic bases of criminality, intelligence, and so forth. What am I saying? We must keep focused on changing the nature of power in this world, regardless of the debates about what is going on. If you get caught up in the details, you're going to lose the focus. One other thing, and I'm through. We got some people out here looking for conspiracies. I want to note this because I see a lot of this going on, and there are people on the circus getting over on the conspiracy number. And there are others, you know. Let me just warn you about one thing, black people. You must think in terms of a nation. You must think of yourself as a nation. It's very important that you think of yourself as a nation. Many of the issues that you see confronting you can become very clear if you think of yourself as a nation surrounded by other nations. I tell people, I haven't written the second book on the cause of violence, the economic cause of violence, but there is an economic cause. I talked about the psychodynamics in Black on Black, but there's another part of the story, which is the economics. Quickly me, it's like this, ladies and gentlemen. If you saw black people in the United States as a nation, you would recognize that to a very great extent, the social disorganization that we complain about, the breakdown of families and institutions, the criminality of our children and so forth, is the result of the fact that as a nation, black people are suffering from a negative trade imbalance, In other words, black people have an overwhelming national debt. What do we mean by that? It means that more of your money, earnings, income are flowing out than what? Are flowing in. You jumped for equal opportunity and you educated your most talented people and you sent them away from you and sent them to work for other people. And the monies they earned, you told them to live among those other people so they contribute their brains and skills to your enemies and spend their monies among your enemies and enhance their power. And now they become neoconservative and join the attack on the African community. You understand what I'm saying? Anytime a nation buys more than it sells, anytime that a nation ships its wealth out in great bundles, anytime a nation lets other alien groups, Arabs, Koreans, and others, and whites, come into its midst and take its money out, and then let the drug dealers scrape up the rest and take that money out, their institutions are going to collapse on their heads. Your families are breaking up because they do not have the economic floor that they need to keep them there. Your children are going wild because you don't have the money to give them the appropriate education and recreation and other kind of things you need. You cannot build the institutions that you need to maintain the viability of your society because you're giving it to everyone else. And you're shipping it out. And therefore you suffer from it. Now, with this view in mind, what does this mean? You can solve this problem to a very great extent if you think of yourself as a nation, remove the aliens from your midst, and thrust out into the world and earn wealth and money and bring it back to your nation and watch its prosperity increase and watch the people become more civil with one another, build the kind of institutions to create the kind of schools you want. But until you do that, it's not going to happen. This is the program. Conspiracy, then. There are people out here looking for the mad scientists who made the AIDS gene. And now they're looking at Goodwin. He's the madman that's getting ready to run the nut sort of thing. And there are others who are in the government huddling around. Screw all that. Stop wasting your time hunting for the smoking gun. When you are a nation, you recognize one thing. When you discover the conspiracy, it's too late. Yeah, it's too late. When you discover it, it's too late. If you are a nation, you know what you act on as a nation? You act on capability of your enemy. They can be your friends, as a matter of fact. They can have good relationships with you. But the moment they develop the capacity to destroy you, you don't worry about whether they hate you or love you or they're conspiring against you. You recognize that they have the capacity to destroy you should they what? Want to. You don't search for the conspirators. You search for a way to defend yourself against one what? Should it occur. It's the fact that whites have the capacity to use AIDS that should move us to build a defense. That they have the capacity to destroy African nations that should move us to build a military. That they have the capacity to destroy our people in economic warfare. Not whether they are thinking of doing so or whether there's some person who's doing so. Screw that. Don't put the energy in what? building a defense and an offense on the fact that they are capable of doing so. All right? It's necessary. So, ladies and gentlemen, our eyes, we should do what? Keep the agenda on changing the power relationship, empowering ourselves so that we can defend ourselves regardless of the type of conspiracies any groups have against us. So what does it mean, ladies and gentlemen? Keeping our eyes on the prize. And that prize is power. Power to the people. Thank you very much.